Here in Marrakesh, and to all of the people who are watching this discussion online, wherever they are around the world. I'm David Shukman. For many years, I was a correspondent for BBC News, reporting on a great range of different subjects, including conflicts, climate change, and food security. And it feels to me like all three have come together right now, which is why our discussion this morning is so incredibly timely. I don't know about you, but sometimes I wake up in the morning these days, check the news, and have to kind of pinch myself to remember that it's real. I mean, it's a nightmare, but it's also real. And the idea of farmers in Ukraine going to work in their fields in flak jackets because rockets are landing on their fields. Or the image, which we heard about on the radio this morning, of millions of tons of grain sitting in depots in the ports of the Black Sea, unable to be shipped out. Given the seriousness of the food supply problem, that's a terrible, terrible thought. Because, of course, for so many countries, supplies from Ukraine and from Russia are absolutely vital. That's what the SEMED countries, that's why this subject is so urgent right now. Where we are is on the receiving end, the buying end of a great process that for years has brought grain from the Black Sea, and we're a great deal more about this. Now, all of this crisis brought about by Russia's invasion of Ukraine comes on top of massive disruption in supply chains caused by COVID. Ships getting stuck, ships in the wrong place, a general disruption to supplies, already elevating prices of key foodstuffs long before the tanks rolled over the border into Ukraine. And I think it's important not to forget this point. Under all of this, we're living on a planet that's 1 degree hotter than it was 100 years ago, which means the risk is much greater of heat waves, of droughts, of other extremes like floods, all of which are damaging to the agricultural sector. I mean, here in Morocco, I was reading that there's the worst drought for 40 years. Someone will correct me, I'm sure. India is just enduring a ferocious heat wave, and I was reading that that will damage the harvests of wheat in that country, and they do export a fair bit. Yesterday, France said a drought there would likely affect the wheat harvest. So climate is a real factor underpinning all of the crisis that we face right now. The good news is we've got a fantastic panel to discuss this, to illuminate the different aspects of the crisis and use them right now. So, joining us from Rome, Katia Krivonos, who's senior economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization. She and her colleagues have done a great job gathering the latest data for us, and we'll hear from Katia shortly. Also joining online, Sébastien Aby. Sébastien, good to see you there. He's been busy on the French media as an expert in food security, and he runs Club Demeter. With us, delighted to see you, Marie-Hélène Loison, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the French Development Agency. We're going to be hearing about some of the ideas and actions being taken to tackle this crisis. Next to me here, Gerald Tess, Chairman of SEMED, UK, a big grain trader. You're right caught in the middle, aren't you, Gerald, between the supply problems and the buyers, and you will, I know, share your insights. Mustafa Shahar is from Crédit Agricole du Maroc. One of the big angles we'll discuss is how to encourage local producers to increase production, and clearly finance is absolutely critical to that. Last, right at the end of the line there, but definitely not least, we have Jean-Marc Peterschmidt, who's Managing Director for the EBRD of Industry, commerce and agribusiness, which is the subject for us today. We'll come to all of you very, very shortly. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The event will be recorded. It'll last an hour. That means we won't have time, I'm afraid, for normal Q&A, but we do really want to hear from you. We want to hear your perspectives, your voice on this vital topic, and we're going to do that with the help of the Slido.com app. Let's take a quick look at that to see if we can bring that up. If you could download it to your mobile phones. I'm not hearing myself back in delay, but let's hope we can kill that. If we can bring up the Slido.com app, that would be great. If you haven't downloaded it already, please do. Now's a good moment, because you will be invited to use it in other sessions during the course of this annual meeting over the next couple of days. If you do find Slido.com, enter the code 917000, 917000. Look for this event, Food Security in Times of Crisis, a special focus on SEMED, and enter the first word that comes into your mind when you think of food security. Whatever that word is, we'd like to see it, because we want to build up a word picture, a word cloud, and get a sense of where you think the priorities are. And of course, this is open to all of you who are watching online. So please, Slido.com, code 917000, and just whatever word comes to mind. I've got my own ideas about a single word, but these days I'm predictions wrong, so I won't venture a guess as to what you'll come up with, but please do take part in that. It'll be a great way for us to get an impression of what you're all thinking when it comes to this issue. Let's crack on right away. As I mentioned, Katya at the FAO has done a great job for us, a lot of homework, because it's very difficult to get the best possible data about the harvests, about the supply, about prices, about the situation, both in countries like Ukraine and in countries, the SEMED countries, looking to buy grain from Ukraine. So, Katya, great to see you there. And you'll be giving us our only formal presentation this morning. Katya, you've got 10 minutes with your PowerPoint. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, and thank you for your kind invitation. I'm very happy to join you today and deliver this presentation on food security and trade in SEMED countries, to helping to set the scene for this discussion. So if I could please have the slides on the screen, then we could start.
They should come up there. We're not seeing them yet. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Lovely.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is just to show that I will be speaking very briefly about two topics today. First, I will outline the state of food insecurity and nutrition in the world and the risks that we're seeing today, and then focus a bit on the situation in the SEMED countries, and these are Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia, as data for West Bank and Gaza are quite scarce, unfortunately. And then I will also speak about the exposure of SEMED countries to market risks generated by the war in Ukraine. Next slide, please. According to 2021 edition of the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, between 720 and 811 million people in the world faced chronic hunger, and around 118 people were more than in 2009. So there was a big increase in 2020. It is also projected that around 660 million may still face hunger in 2030, including tens of millions linked to possible lasting effects of the pandemic. And of course, we're not yet taking into account the impacts of the recent war in Ukraine. Next slide. I should also mention that beyond hunger, the level of acute food insecurity is alarming. Actually, in 2021, 193 million people were living in crisis or worse, and this number nearly doubled from 2016. So we're unfortunately not on track to achieve the SDGs on food security. How did we get to this critical point? There are four major drivers at play, undermining food security and nutrition, and then also negatively interrelated between each other, compounding impacts to our food systems. These include first, drivers that are external to food systems, conflicts, climate variability and extremes, and drivers that are internal to food systems. For example, low productivity and inefficient food supply chains that are pushing up the cost of nutritious foods, making healthy diets unaffordable for millions. And of course, high and persistent levels of inequality make the situation worse. Next slide, please. So now looking at the SEMED countries, since 2014-16, the levels of food insecurity increased, which is a worrying development. And we noticed the highest rates in Jordan and Lebanon, which are above 9%. In 2021, conflict and insecurity were the primary drivers of food crisis. So in Egypt, in Jordan and Lebanon, one of the most vulnerable groups is Syrian refugees. And among these countries that we're looking at today, Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees among food crisis countries. And this is where the prevalence of acute food insecurity is highest. So for example, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, it's 49%, almost half. Moreover, an unprecedented economic, political, and public health crisis unfolded in Lebanon in 2021, making it much more severe, this crisis. At the same time, we note that the region is also marked by high rates of overweight and obesity in population. Obesity, in fact, is significant and growing, in particular in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, which is at the rates that the rates of overweight and obesity are more than double of the global. And another thing to note is the MENA countries, so the region, the Near East and North Africa, so going beyond just the SEMED countries, will continue depending on imports to satisfy domestic demand for key products. So this is really one of the key net food importing regions in the world. Next slide, please. Today, global markets are facing multiple challenges and interconnected risks. International food prices are at all-time high. The food price index jumped in March to unprecedented levels, reflecting new all-time highs, especially for vegetable oils, cereals, and meats. In April 2022, the index declined slightly, stabilizing, but still it's worth noting that we had all-time high level of food prices since food price index was measured in 1990. Domestic prices are also increasing, driven by conflict and disruptions and severe weather shocks. And the war in Ukraine has further exacerbated the situation, disrupting grain supplies. Next slide, please. The war in Ukraine will have serious implications for supply of basic food products in many developing countries in particular, and have consequences for international prices, as we are already witnessing. Russia and Ukraine both make strong contribution to world production and export of key staples. Combined, these two countries account for 30% of global wheat exports, for example, and 20% of maize. Countries depend on imports from these countries. So, for example, in Near East and North Africa, it's countries such as Egypt and Turkey, but there are also a number of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that will face very serious consequences of these price increases and disruptions in supplies. Next slide. So what do these, and next again, please. So what do these developments in global markets and these risks, what do they mean for these SEMED countries? So here we look, for example, at the depiction where on the left y-axis, we see import dependency ratio, so that the share of imports in the total domestic availability of calories, and the right y-axis shows the share of population that is undernourished. Just one note on Morocco, although this country typically is less import dependent than others on this graph, but Morocco is facing one of the worst droughts in decades, and consequently, its food imports have already increased. So what do we note? Is that all countries present, and also Turkey, are net importers of calories and rely heavily on global markets to source dietary energy. At the extreme level, Jordan sources more than 80% of all calories that are available in the country through imports. and both Jordan and Lebanon are the countries with highest rates of undernourishment. So this reliance on imports really means that global supply shocks and price swings will affect these countries, and they are already affecting these countries in the various. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at the direct dependence of SEMED countries on Ukraine and Russia for imported foods. On the left y-axis, we see again food import dependency ratio to illustrate the importance of aggregate imports in total availability calories. While on the right y-axis, we're showing the share of Russia and Ukraine in aggregate imports of dietary energy. The size of bubbles is proportional to the number of undernourished people, so not the share of undernourished, but rather the scale of possible consequences, because we can take into account the relative size of population in all the countries to show how these price increases might affect large populations. And so this is something to really be cautious about. The key message that emerges here is that Russia and Ukraine are important direct suppliers of energy in food terms to SEMED countries. So for example, Egypt, on average, sourced about 42% of all the calories that it imports from Russia and Ukraine over 2017-2019. And this is affecting all of the countries on this graph, this crisis. Next slide. In these graphs, we see two indicators for three product groups that we have, for which we have seen the highest price increases: wheat, sunflower oil, and cereals other than wheat. So the first indicator here, which is the vertical line, are product-specific import dependency ratios. So for example, here we see in Egypt, the share of import in the quality of wheat and products is just over 50%. The second indicator, which is shown by blue and orange bars, these are the shares of Russia and Ukraine in the total imports of a country, of that particular item. So here we're using most recent data, which is 2021. Again, what we reemphasize that the SEMED countries rely on imports for domestic availability of wheat, sunflower oil, and other cereals, and Russia and Ukraine are key direct suppliers. And this is evident for wheat in particular. So for example, in Egypt, 75%, as well as in Lebanon, 75% of wheat is imported from either Russia or Ukraine. Next slide, please. And that is my last slide. So here, what does it mean, this dependency on Ukraine and Russia from risks and policy perspective? We can say a lot about the need to diversify import sources, keep trade open, and avoid ad hoc policy reactions, but we would like to single specific indicator here. And this is the rising food import bill. On the left y-axis, we see gross food import bills per capita, just to put it in a comparable scale across countries, split across three product groups: cereals and preparations, oils and fats, and oilseeds. And all of these are the items that Russia and Ukraine export in big quantities and for which we have seen rapid increases over the last months. And on the right y-axis, we see shares of these three food groups in the total food import bill of a country, just to show how important they are. So food import bills in SEMED can be expected to increase even further since the war in Ukraine started, and we're seeing this high global food prices at the moment. So SEMED countries will need to adopt a variety of measures to mitigate the negative effects of the food insecurity brought by this crisis. And these can be both short and medium to long term. And I'm sure in this panel, we'll talk a lot about that. But measures include diversification of food import sources, making imports more efficient. But at the same time, SEMED countries should also prioritize long-term food system transformation in raising competitiveness of the high-value exports, such as fruits, vegetables, and olive oil, which will help to sustain the high cost of food imports. So let me stop here. Thank you, David.
Katja, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating, revealing, and actually pretty alarming presentation. I mean, so many stunning facts out of that. One that leaps off the page for me is Egypt. 40% of calories in Egypt come from Ukraine and Russia. Just worth pausing for thought on that. Katja, I'm going to come back to you with a quick follow-up question But just before that, let's take a look at the word cloud. Remember, just a little while ago, I asked you to go on slido.com and just think of a word that was prompted by the thought of food security. Look at that, wheat. So you can all see that pretty clearly. Wheat, by far the dominant one there. Peace. Oh, we've lost it already. Let's see it again if we can. I saw the word peace near the center there. There we go. Peace, supply chain, inflation are all the ones that seem to dominate. So continue to take part in this process. We'll take another look at the word cloud a little later towards the end of our session. But it just gives you an indication of what we're all thinking, a fascinating array of different words there. Katja, I just wanted to come back to really, you talked about measures that the SEMED countries will need to adopt. What for you, if you like, is the single most important thing to help them through this current crisis?
Thank you, David. It would be very difficult to single one thing because we need an array of measures. As an overarching principle, at FAO, we emphasize that we need to keep trade in food, but also fertilizers and fuel open and unrestricted. We need to avoid ad hoc policy reactions, and countries need to commit to long-term and comprehensive national food security strategies. We need to keep market transparency, dialogue, and information flowing so that we know how much is actually produced and can be shipped, how much we have in stocks across the world. This is extremely important at the time of crisis. If we're then looking at what the SEMED countries could do in this very critical situation, in the short term, it is important to pay attention to these rising food import bills. And so the countries may have to think about establishing or joining an existing some kind of food import financing facility. Financing food imports will be critical as prices nearly doubled for many commodities. And at the same time, countries need to work on the diversification of the food import sources to reduce the cost of imported foods. So that could also mean adjustment in requirements, for example, tender specifications, allowing more private sector players to come in to help sustain the high cost of imports, and simplifying fast-track clearance procedures. At the same time, supporting vulnerable groups. I have to put point, in this critical time, we do need to make the existing programs much more agile, targeted, and think about expanding them, because it is the poorest people who will bear the highest cost of this war and in this current crisis.
Absolutely right. Katja, thank you. That's a real insight there. Now, I mean, clearly, this isn't the first time we've had a food security crisis, but it may prove to be the worst or one of the worst. And someone who's really followed this whole question for many, many years is Sébastien. Sébastien, it's great to have you join us there. And I've enjoyed your contributions in the French media on this question. Give us, if you would, your historical perspective, in particular of wheat, which stood out in the word cloud, the importance of wheat to the people of North Africa.
Thank you, David. I will talk the floor in French. Le sujet de l'insécurité alimentaire pour le bassin méditerranéen est un sujet ancien. Il y a de la croissance démographique, il y a de la rareté de l'eau, il y a peu de terres agricoles, il y a des changements climatiques plus puissants et plus anciens aussi que dans d'autres régions du monde. Et nous avons malheureusement aussi une des régions de la planète qui est les plus impactées par des crises politiques, des conflits. Et tout cela ne facilite pas évidemment le développement agricole et la sécurité alimentaire. Dans le nuage de mots proposés d'ailleurs, on voit que plusieurs participants ont évoqué l'importance de la paix pour la sécurité alimentaire. Alors, il est vrai que la question du blé est extrêmement illustrative des tensions structurelles de la sécurité alimentaire pour l'Afrique du Nord et le Proche-Orient. j'aime bien rappeler que dans cet espace, le pain, les pâtes sont l'élément de base de l'alimentation, de la nutrition. Nous consommons au sud de la Méditerranée des quantités records par personne de blé sous ses différentes formes. Et malgré une production qui a augmenté ces dernières années, y compris parce que ces pays ont essayé de construire davantage de sécurité alimentaire à domicile, les besoins sont tellement en croissance que finalement les importations ont été également en forte évolution. Aujourd'hui, si vous prenez les pays du Maroc à l'Égypte, c'est 2% de la population mondiale, mais c'est à peu près 20% des importations mondiales de blé. Donc vous avez un rapport important et une hypersensibilité aux évolutions du marché international, à la fois les volumes disponibles ou la qualité évidemment, mais aussi le prix. Et dans ce contexte, ces dernières années, beaucoup de pays du Maghreb se sont tournés vers la Russie ou l'Ukraine, deux superpuissances agricoles qui ont augmenté leurs exportations, leur logistique, et en même temps avec des prix qui étaient plus compétitifs, des blés nord-américains ou européens. Le résultat aujourd'hui, c'est que vous avez une situation qui est factuelle. Le Maghreb, l'Égypte, le Proche-Orient consomment toujours autant, voire plus de blé. On achète de plus en plus sur les marchés internationaux. Et la difficulté financière dans ces pays n'amène pas des changements de pratiques alimentaires. Les céréales sont la base de la sécurité alimentaire, mais ces céréales proviennent de plus en plus de l'extérieur, avec par conséquent une exposition aux risques qui sont à la fois des chocs géopolitiques, comme dans le cas de la guerre en Ukraine, des chocs logistiques, comme la pandémie depuis 2 ans de Covid entraîne, mais également des chocs climatiques. Parce que nous voyons aujourd'hui des pays qui, comme le Maroc, ont une sécheresse importante et qui va entraîner une réduction des récoltes céréalières cette année. De la même manière, vous avez des pays exportateurs de céréales, États-Unis ou l'Europe et la France, qui subissent des sécheresses également. Dans ce contexte, je crois que géopolitiquement, il y a une nécessité en Méditerranée d'avoir des approches de sécurité alimentaire solidaires pour faire en sorte que quand il y a des chocs importants, peut-être des mécanismes de solidarité, des prix raisonnables, accessibles, des échanges commerciaux garantis soient organisés pour éviter précisément de l'instabilité sociale et parfois politique qui peuvent menacer la stabilité de ces pays. Et dans ce contexte, je crois que le travail des organisations internationales comme la FAO, financières comme la BERD, les organisations régionales comme le SIAM, doivent, avec les États de la région, avec le secteur privé, avec les milieux académiques et de la recherche, essayer toujours de travailler ensemble pour réduire les incertitudes et faire en sorte qu'entre plus de production
and ensure
la région méditerranéenne
together more production
s'accompagne de mécanismes d'échange scientifiques,
take place in
techniques,
the
logistiques
region
et commerciaux
with
qui
scientific,
permettent
technical,
d'améliorer
commercial
la
exchanges
sécurité
that
alimentaire d'un espace en
could
surchauffe.
improve food security in these
Et il est en
regions suffering
surchauffe
from
malheureusement
an
pour des
excess
raisons climatiques,
of shocks,
mais aussi géopolitiques.
and that is overheating
Et
in
le
a way,
blé
overheating
est,
for
le
climate-related reasons, but
d'une
also
région qui
geopolitical reasons. And the wheat is like a mirror
absolument trouver
for what
des
happens in
réponses
this
par le
region that
collectif
really has to find
afin de
collective
limiter les
answers
incertitudes et les risques
to
sur le
limit
plan
uncertainties and risks
Sebastien,
on
thank you
food
very,
supply.
very much indeed. You've covered a great deal of ground. I think everybody would agree. The extraordinary set of consequences and implications that stem from everything we've discussed so far, the kind of facts laid out by Katja, with the political, social, and humanitarian consequences, the shocks, as Sebastian describes it. Sebastian, thank you very, very much indeed for that contribution. We're short on time. We're going to move on to the rest of our panelists, but we're very grateful for that perspective that you've shared with us, Sebastian. Thank you very much indeed. That leads me straight to Gérald sitting beside me here. I mean, as someone buying grain, selling grain, kind of what's going on for you right now?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it'll come up.
To be honest, it was not the best time for a trader these last 2-3 months. But all this food inflation and grain prices increase is not didn't start on February 24. Basically, it all started, as you mentioned, more than 2 years ago with COVID crisis, definitely. And we start to see some funny behavior from, let's say, protectionist behavior from starting by China, who started to buy massively grain, especially corn, in order to cap the meat inflation in China. That was the first disruption, massive one. And then we saw Russia, again, all about inflation, willing to cap the internal Russian inflation in food, especially bread, starting to implement quotas. That means limiting the quantity that can be exported.
Right.
And also implementing a funny one, which was export taxes, which had a direct effect to level up the world price of wheat. It was also followed by Argentina, which at this moment did about the same than Russia, increased taxes and limit the export volume.
So supply was already quite restricted.
Yes, indeed. So and this led for a first set of inflation, which basically was not a small one because it was about 50%. So we saw the price moving up 50%. Then February 24, I think it's like 9/11. I mean, on the grain trader memory, it will stay for a while. We had a tsunami. Let's call it a tsunami. You know, the film Sleepless in Seattle, it was our case. We didn't sleep much for a while. Just to illustrate, for a week, for 8, to be precise, for 8 trading sessions in Chicago Board of Trade, which is the main future market, we saw 8 days of limit up, which means you go from one limit to another one, you extend the limit and you go to the other one, etc., etc. And this move in 8 days, I repeat, 8 days, we saw a move of nearly $200 per ton, which in percentage, price rise of 160%.
Wow.
In 8 days.
Had you ever seen that before?
We saw that in 2007 with the big drought, and especially in Russia, when Russia intervened and did implement an export ban, but it was not in 8 days.
Right. Okay. So this was a different order of magnitude.
This one was a shock. So It was, if you ask me, the feeling of the trader during this period, it was a nightmare. A real one.
But a real one?
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked a bit about in my introduction, how there's all this grain sitting in these depots on the Black Sea, not moving. And at the same time, farmers are trying to produce. What's your sense, what's your own outlook, your perspective on kind of where we're heading next, the next season? Because I guess the question behind that is, are we talking about just an immediate crisis, I say just, or something that might drag on longer?
I'm sorry to say I don't know.
Okay.
Right. If we speak about long term, today I would say that a day is like a month before. Nobody knows when this war will end and how it will end. Will the flag be Ukrainian? Will the flag be Russian? Nobody knows.
Right.
So even if it stopped tomorrow, the trading sector, don't think that the things will go back to normal, meaning logistic, bridges broken, railway broken, even some silos, whatever, logistic in general, and also about the sanctions. So I know the food is not supposed to be in the sanctions, but still it's making things very difficult for exporter trading houses. So even if it stopped, we will not go back to normal with a click of finger. So we believe that in this environment, we will keep prices at a very high level. The thing is that it's going to be extremely volatile. And the other thing is that world importers, will have to make some shift on their sources. I mean, in current environment, nobody believes that the war will stop tomorrow. I mean, if you read all the paper, it's like you think it's going to stay forever. Or you have to change your sources or to change your manner of buying. We may see some government-to-government purchase, like Russia having agreement with Egypt, with Russia having agreement with Iran, things like that, back to the 90s.
Right.
So less private, more government-to-government, and prices should stay high. And furthermore, just my last word about that, and as you said, as you mentioned, and as Sebastian also mentioned, that means that you can't afford to have any problem on production. The Northern Hemisphere production is 2 months away, and for the week in France, it's going to be 28 degrees, like in June. It's too early. It's not bad. Maybe you're losing a couple of quintals per hectare. Who knows, during the 2 months, the weather, it's extreme every year. So we saw, for example, last year in the US, in June, July, let's say mid-August, we lost 20 million tons of wheat just because of the drought, like in the 1930s.
So there could be another shock in one of the big producers. Gerald, we're going to leave it there. That's a fascinating insight into your take on this whole situation. We'll come to Marie-Hélène next, but just before we do, another reminder to check out the slido.com, contribute to the word cloud, and we'll take a look at that at the end of the session. Marie-Hélène, having heard everything we've heard so far, what kind of steps, what kind of measures can the French Development Agency take to try to help with this situation?
Comme le disait Sébastien Bis tout à l'heure, évidemment, les enjeux de sécurité alimentaire et de nutrition ne sont pas des enjeux nouveaux, très clairement. Ce qui est peut-être nouveau, entre guillemets, dans cette crise, c'est que, d'une part, les projecteurs sont beaucoup braqués en fait sur le Moyen-Orient, et même si, alors il le disait, en fait c'est des enjeux qui existent depuis longtemps dans cette région, confèrent les printemps arabes, où on sait que, enfin, on suppose qu'un des facteurs déclenchants a quand même été la hausse des prix alimentaires à ce moment-là, mais c'est vrai que traditionnellement, quand on pense sécurité alimentaire, on associe ça quand même aujourd'hui. Le focus va être beaucoup, également pour l'Afrique subsaharienne, mais quand même beaucoup pour l'Afrique du Nord, Moyen-Orient. Et d'autre part, quand on travaille sur ces enjeux, traditionnellement, on est pas mal focalisé sur les effets du changement climatique et puis des facteurs économiques locaux. Ce qui est évidemment assez nouveau, et vous venez d'en parler, c'est cette perturbation majeure des échanges internationaux qui a une influence très directe, évidemment, sur les prix et sur la disponibilité également de la production. Et ça, on n'a sans doute pas fini d'en voir d'en voir les conséquences. Donc, dans ce contexte, comme vous le savez, en fait, la France, le président Macron avait proposé lors d'un sommet du G7 une nouvelle initiative Farm, Food and Agriculture Resilience Mission, avec précisément différents piliers, commerce international, solidarité, et un pilier production pour pouvoir en fait aider un certain nombre de pays à renforcer leur production locale. Et c'est évidemment sur ce troisième pilier que l'AFD se positionne pour agir. Ce qui est important pour nous, c'est qu'on souhaite agir sur différentes temporalités parce qu'il y a à la fois des enjeux de très court terme, hein, évidemment on est dans une crise, et puis des enjeux également de moyen et long terme. Et c'est important pour nous de pouvoir agir sur ces différentes temporalités. Sur le très court terme, ce que l'on souhaite faire, c'est faciliter autant que possible l'accès à la production et l'accès aux biens essentiels pour les pays, pour les populations les plus vulnérables. Et ça va se traduire pour nous à travers une action sur le renforcement des systèmes de protection sociale, que ça passe par des systèmes gouvernementaux ou par des systèmes que l'on met en œuvre de façon un peu ad hoc, y compris avec des ONG, pour permettre aux populations vulnérables d'acheter des biens alimentaires, mais également des intrants agricoles, engrais, semences, etc. Et d'autre part, ce qu'on fait également cette année, c'est d'agir sur la reconstitution des stocks. On a par exemple augmenté nos financements pour la CEDEAO, qui gère en fait une partie des stocks régionaux en Afrique de l'Ouest. Pour permettre que ces stocks soient en fait en prévision de la prochaine campagne agricole. Par ailleurs, on sait qu'on va avoir un certain nombre de soutien budgétaire d'un certain nombre d'États, puisqu'on le sait en fait dans la région, en Afrique du Nord notamment, et en fait le prix de la farine, du pain, du gaz également est très fortement subventionné, et donc l'impact budgétaire pour les gouvernements va être extrêmement important, et là aussi on va avoir des demandes là-dessus, et ce qui va être important pour nous, c'est de poursuivre un dialogue qu'on a déjà avec ces gouvernements sur en fait comment mieux cibler ces subventions. On sait que c'est évidemment un facteur de stabilité politique extrêmement important, et en même temps le coût va être tellement terriblement, et il y a peut-être moyen de cibler un petit peu mieux finalement l'octroi de ces subventions. Et on a par exemple un projet en Tunisie actuellement dans le secteur agricole pour aider le gouvernement finalement à peut-être mieux cibler les subventions vers les petites exploitations agricoles. À moyen terme, ce sur quoi on souhaite agir, c'est plusieurs choses. D'une part, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, comment on peut augmenter la production locale et donc un peu plus d'autonomie en fait et de résilience à des chocs extérieurs, y compris en réfléchissant un petit peu au type de production qui peut être encouragée, y compris peut-être un peu plus sur des protéines végétales. On agit également avec des banques agricoles, y compris avec le Crédit agricole du Maroc, à travers des lignes de crédit pour financer les petites exploitations agricoles, fournir des garanties, fournir de l'assistance technique pour faire évoluer les pratiques agricoles dans ce sens-là. Et on y reviendra peut-être tout à l'heure. Crédit agricole du Maroc a une filiale Tamouil El Fella qui cible très spécifiquement en fait les petites exploitations agricoles au Maroc.
So can I just interrupt there? So it's clearly a key part of your strategy is to encourage more local production wherever possible. Is that agribusinesses and smallholders? How do you see the emphasis going on that?
Alors, en tout cas, le fait de mettre un peu plus l'accent sur les petites exploitations est important pour nous parce qu'évidemment, c'est là, en termes d'enjeux, en termes d'accès au financement, c'est là où pour nous sont les enjeux. Je pense que les plus grandes exploitations peuvent se financer plus facilement. En revanche, on sait que les petits agriculteurs, en termes de... ils ont moins accès au financement, il y a moins d'épargne et ils sont donc beaucoup plus vulnérables en fait aux fluctuations des marchés et aux différentes crises. Donc pour nous, effectivement, en tant que banque de développement en tout cas, le focus est plus particulièrement sur là, d'où les actions que nous avons développées avec le Crédit agricole du Maroc.
Great, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry we're short of time. People, it's a fascinating perspective you bring there and leads us beautifully to Mustafa. I mean, as the name of your bank suggests, you're heavily involved in the agricultural sector. I mean, what more can you do to encourage farmers, let's say in Morocco, where you operate, to production to help with this crisis. I guess it won't be an immediate response, but it will be a response that will perhaps bear fruit in time.
Merci beaucoup pour votre question. J'aimerais bien réagir par rapport aux conséquences, disons, de la guerre russo-ukrainienne avant d'aborder le financement qui est un levier important, notamment l'accès des petits fermiers au financement. Je pense que, comme le Covid, comme la sécheresse, cette guerre vient exacerber un peu les contraintes qui existent dans chaque pays au niveau de son système alimentaire. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas une problématique d'offre parce que les dernières campagnes agricoles dans les pays exportateurs étaient très bonnes, généralement. Et donc, c'est plutôt une problématique de surcoût par rapport aux pays importateurs que sont, comme ce qu'on a vu, l'Égypte, la Turquie, bien sûr des pays asiatiques comme le Bangladesh, le Pakistan, l'Azerbaïdjan, et bien sûr les pays de l'Afrique du Nord, dans le Maroc, et bien sûr le Liban, etc., etc. Que faire aujourd'hui face à cette problématique? Moi, je pense qu'il y a deux grandes réponses. La première réponse, je vais très vite, c'est de ne pas céder à la tentation de restreindre les échanges alimentaires internationaux, parce que ça aura beaucoup de conséquences, et même sur la paix internationale. Et je salue un peu l'initiative de l'Union européenne de mobiliser les 5 à 7% de leurs terres gelées pour des raisons des ondes CO2. Donc c'est une très bonne décision. Aujourd'hui, il y a même des propositions au niveau du Sénat américain pour subventionner certains pays dans leurs opérations d'importation pour diminuer un peu le coût. Ça, c'est vraiment quelque chose au niveau international. Au niveau de chaque pays, je pense que la réponse intelligente et humaniste, c'est de soutenir le pouvoir d'achat des populations vulnérables pour qu'ils ne subissent pas ce surcoût. Et c'est vraiment continuer à transformer l'agriculture de chaque pays pour qu'il soit plus performante, plus intégrée, résiliente et respectueuse, bien sûr, de l'environnement et de la durabilité. Voilà. Et le financement dans cette stratégie, notamment la transformation de l'agriculture de chaque pays, est un levier très important aux côtés des autres interventions des acteurs de l'écosystème agricole rural de chaque pays. Alors, pourquoi le financement est très très important? Parce que d'abord la structure des agricultures dans plusieurs pays, même des pays qui importent aujourd'hui les céréales, les huiles oléagineuses, mais aussi le maïs, etc. C'est une problématique de taille des agriculteurs. Nous n'avons pas eu la même évolution à l'européenne, comme ce qui s'est passé en France, avec disons, un agrandissement de superficie, une mécanisation, une grande productivité, etc.
Land area, increase in productivity, mechanization.
Qui représentent
Here
75%
we have
d'agriculteurs,
smallholders
qui ont par exemple
who
un terrain
represent
de 5 hectares.
75% of our
Et
total
donc,
output
nous avons une
in
agriculture
terms of
familiale
agriculture.
et qui n'est pas
Therefore, we have
toujours
a
et qui ne
family-based
dispose pas toujours de
agricultural
moyens
sector which doesn't
pour
always have
présenter
the
des
means
dossiers
necessary
bancables acceptés par les banques
to
commerciales pur et
present
dur. Il y a un risque
requests for
climatique, il y a un
finance which
risque
will
de
be
maladie, il
accepted.
y a un risque de
There are, of
prix,
course,
il y a une faible
climate risk,
productivité.
price
Ils ne
risk,
sont pas de très bons clients
productivity
si on est
risks,
une banque
and they are
commerciale
not
pure et
very
dure.
good clients
Donc il
if
faut,
we are a normal
changer
commercial
de
bank.
paradigme, il faut une
Therefore,
approche
we
de
need to change
financement
paradigm.
très adaptée à
We
cette
need to
réalité,
have
en
a
commençant par le
finance
modèle
program which is
organisationnel de développement, et c'est ce qu'a fait le
fit for
Crédit Agricole
purpose for
depuis
this reality.
2003. Nous avons fait une
Since
transformation
2003, Crédit Agricole
institutionnelle
has
profonde
completely
par rapport au financement de
transformed
l'agriculture au
our
Maroc. Ça a
institution
bien marché,
with
nous avons
regards
eu
to the
beaucoup de succès,
financing of
que ce soit dans
agriculture in
l'accompagnement
Morocco.
du
It
plan
has
européen,
had a lot of
aujourd'hui
success,
avec la nouvelle stratégie
whether it was
Génération
in the
Green.
past or
Alors,
today with our new
le modèle
Green
organisationnel du
Generation
groupe
strategy.
Crédit Agricole est d'abord
So
deux
the
banques en une. Si je peux
Organisation
l'exprimer
of
comme ça,
Crédit
on a
Agricole is like
diversifié,
two banks.
on
We
finance
have
les autres activités,
diversified.
les autres secteurs
We are financing
gagner de
activities
l'argent.
other
urbain
to
pour
make
collecter
money.
des ressources
We
en milieu
have
urbain parce que
a
les ressources des
citywide,
propriétaires existent en ville
program
pour
in
pouvoir
order
les
to get
réinjecter
resources
dans le milieu rural et
from
notamment
cities in order
permettre
to
aux
be able to
agriculteurs
reinject
d'acquérir des
these
inputs
resources
et
into rural areas,
des engrais,
which will
la
enable
mécanisation,
the farmers to be able to
l'irrigation,
buy
des
fertilizers, to
semences
mechanize,
se
to be able to
reconvertir
select
de la
their
céréaliculture
crops,
qui n'est
to
pas très
be able
productive
to
vers
go
des
from
cultures à
grain
valeur
production,
ajoutée,
which
etc.
isn't very productive,
Donc
towards
déjà
higher
le
value
modèle
crops,
lui-même
etc.
viable
So the
et
model in
n'est
itself
pas
is
basé sur les
sustainable
subventions étatiques
and
chaque
is
année
not
qu'on reçoit,
based on
etc. etc.
a
Donc, c'est vraiment de
year-on-year
l'autonomie de gestion.
government
Le deuxième, c'est
subsidy
que
system.
nous avons
It is
segmenté
therefore
le marché
autonomous.
agricole.
The second point
Le
is
marché
that we have
agricole, vous avez
segmented the
20% des
agricultural
exploitations
markets.
agricoles au
We
Maroc
had
aujourd'hui
20%
qui ont des garanties,
of
qui sont bancables.
food
D'ailleurs,
exports in Morocco,
98%
which are
sont chez nous, mais
guaranteed,
2%
which are
sont chez les
bankable.
banques confrères
45%
avec
are
une
with us, but
concurrence
also 2% are
loyale.
with other
Et
banks.
vous avez 80% qui sont
Good standards of
des
competition.
petites
And then we have
exploitations
25%
agricoles ou
which
des
are
exploitations
small
qui ne peuvent pas présenter des garanties, qui ne peuvent pas
farmers
avoir
or
à
farmers
ce
who
qu'on
cannot
appelle le
give
financement classique par les
guarantees
banques.
and
Et
don't
là,
have
on les a
access to
encore
classic financing
sous-segmentés.
from
Nous
banks.
avons
There
40%
they are,
qui sont du ressort du
sub-segmented,
microcrédit, avec la
get
filière du
microcredits
Crédit Agricole en matière de
with
microfinance.
a
Et nous
foundation
avons
which
créé
is backed
pour
by Crédit Agricole.
les 40% restants
And
que
for the
la microfinance ne peut pas
40%
accompagner
remaining,
parce qu'il faut des investissements,
who
et
cannot
c'est des
use
cycles
microfinance
lents et
because you
des
need
montants très importants,
investments
et qui ne peuvent
and
pas
sums of
avoir
money,
accès
and
au financement
who
classique,
therefore
en
don't
tout cas
have
aux règles
access
prudentielles de
either
la
to
Banque centrale. Nous avons
classic
créé
financing,
Mustafa,
at least not
can I
from
just
the
interrupt there
central
just
bank.
to ask a question? Presumably, a lot of farmers sensing higher prices will just themselves be encouraged to plant crops to benefit from that, but at the same time, they'll face the higher cost of the inputs, the fertilizer. How can you help with that particular dilemma?
L'objectif principal, c'est d'abord de leur donner accès au financement, qu'ils puissent être financés par une banque, même s'ils ne disposent pas de et s'ils ont des difficultés, s'ils ne sont pas très rentables, etc. C'est un financement solidaire. Je pense que Temouil Fellah, qui est disons, une structure de financement adaptée qui a été très bien même aidée par l'AFD au début avec 2 lignes de 20 millions d'euros, 40 millions d'euros, nous a permis de tester. Et c'est un modèle exceptionnel qui n'existe nulle part. Nous pouvons accompagner des agriculteurs qui n'ont pas de garantie, mais qui veulent se moderniser. C'est ça. Et le modèle, le fonds de garantie de l'État à 60%, il y a des règles prudentielles adaptées qui ne sont pas celles vont faire de 3, 6, 9 mois, mais plutôt 1 année, 2 années, 3 années. Il y a tout un mécanisme de mitigation de risque, une approche par filière, une approche par région, des projets modèles et avec un suivi qui mixe un peu l'activité bancaire avec le suivi de proximité de la microfinance. Donc nous pouvons améliorer les itinéraires techniques des exploitations agricoles petites et améliorer les rendements et participer à la sécurité alimentaire du Maroc.
Mustafa, thank you very much indeed. And it's fascinating how you've built on some of the ideas from Marie-Hélène, and I think we're heading somewhere. So, Jean-Marc, by any means, I mean, for the EBRD, this is a difficult situation because you're engaged both in the great agricultural productive region of Ukraine, Russia, and the SEMED countries. You're seeing both sides. What can the EBRD do? We've heard about the French Development Agency, about Crédit Agricole du Maroc. What can the EBRD do in the face of this crisis?
David, thank you. And yes, you're right. This is a difficult situation for the EBRD and for all actors, but the EBRD and IFIs in general, development agencies, they are here precisely to respond in difficult situations. That's where our role becomes even more important. So what are we trying to do to respond to this crisis, both in Ukraine and in SEMED, North Africa and the Middle East? 3 key priorities. The first one, restore, increase financial flows towards the actors in this region. Secondly, restore physical flows. We heard it. It's good to have money flowing, but we actually need the goods to flow as well. Third, promote the right policies. Resist the urge to put up trade barriers. So let me take these 3 in turn. Financial flows, that's obviously what we do as an international financial institutions. 2 aspects there. Trade finance, first of all. Critical because the volumes of trade finance required are much bigger by the simple effect of the commodity prices having increased, and the capacity there of commercial banks with their limits, or ECAs, or insurance companies who are involved in the financing of trade finance, this capacity is being now tested. We need IFIs to step in with additional trade finance. That's exactly what we do with our trade facilitation program, working with financial institutions, both in importing and producing countries and with a network worldwide. And we do so, first of all, in the Ukraine. Very risky at the moment to take risk in the Ukraine. We do that. We've increased by 100 million our trade finance limit in the Ukraine. More than half of that is being used specifically for agricultural inputs. They need to import seeds, fertilizers, machinery, fuel to actually get the tractors running, and pre-export finance. But trade finance globally as well, supporting importers in North Africa to restock now and get access to diversified sources of grain. Financial flows, investment, working capital, and investment support, where EBRD steps in directly, sometimes also alongside local commercial banks. Again, what do we do there? In the Ukraine specifically, right now, we're taking over 100 million worth of new risk on agricultural producers to ensure they remain going concerns, to ensure they actually have the working capital to continue to operate, to ensure they can actually, do all the field works on their winter crops, plant the spring crops, and see it through all the way to the harvest. And so 100 million for Ukraine alongside local commercial banks as well. That's about financial flows. Physical flows, now, it's all good, as we said, to channel money, but how do we get the grain that's sitting in the silos out? That's a very difficult subject in the near term. However, producers in the Ukraine are scrambling for solutions at the moment. And, there's obviously the Black Sea is closed, ports are closed, so the maritime route, which is the bulk of the export flows, are closed, but looking for solution by railway towards the east of the country. It's only a trickle compared to what is
maximum
absolutely
by train.
Absolutely. But there, again, what can we do? Well, support transport operators, support the Ukrainian railways, exactly what we're doing. We're putting 50 million on the table to support UZ, the Ukraine operator, for their operations in general and including agribusiness. Longer term, obviously, the challenge will be, as fast as possible, reconstruction of port facilities and logistics facilities. On the side of the importing countries as well, let's not neglect the need for logistical investments there, need for storage, investment more fluid. Last one, policy. We need all to work together to lift quotas, tariff regime, licensing, import bans at a time when we need as much as possible goods to flow. And there, FAO, EBRD, other IFIs, we really need to act together to get our countries to adopt the right supportive policies.
Just a very quick follow-up, because we mustn't lose sight, as I suggested in my opening remarks, of the climate sustainability agenda in all of this, and you mentioned the policies. I mean, how important is it for the EBRD, as you're thinking of immediate steps, short-term steps and actions, that actually they're not counterproductive to the sustainability agenda?
Very good question. And
but very briefly, if you may.
You said it yourself. This is one crisis superimposing itself on another bigger crisis. And sustainability, being greener, is a central core objective of the EBRD. This is more than half of our investments globally. So in the agribusiness value chain, what does that mean? Is it incompatible, producing more and being more sustainable? We believe it is not. Better practices, better technology, better use of resources are all going to contribute to more sustainable agriculture. Think about fertilizers. Fertilizers, a big input into agriculture. Producing ammonia is hugely gas intensive. But we're working already with private sponsors in our region, in North Africa actually, on green hydrogen produced ammonia. So new technology making that sustainable as well. Let me just close.
That one needs a whole hour of discussion.
Yes.
So I'm going to have to stop you because we really are right out of time. But it's so interesting that there are all these angles. Let's take a quick look at our word cloud. Can we bring that up for a final look? Because actually, the words that were prominent have shifted. What have we got here? Open trade, peace is the central one there. Limit profits on food. That's risen and it's changing all the time. But a whole mix there, really fascinating. I kind of quite like the fact that the central one is peace. Look, in the last couple of minutes, let's just go right back to Katja, if we may, in Rome, who opened this discussion with that brilliant exposition of the situation we're in. Katja, very, very briefly, what have you heard from our panelists today that might give you hope? Because let's try to end on an optimistic note. Is there like one thing you've heard that just gives you a sense of optimism?
Thank you very much, David, for this fascinating discussion. Thank you to all panelists. What I do hear is that it's a close collaboration between all the links in the value chain that need to collaborate to overcome this crisis. So we have heard from bankers, from development institutions, about this need to have capital flowing, about having infrastructure intact and rebuilding, about the crucial role for both trade finance but also for working capital for farmers, that we have at all costs avoid that there is another crisis on top of this other unfolding crisis. And
Katja, I'm going to wrap you up there, but I like the fact that you brought up collaboration right at the start of your closing remarks. And I think everybody's nodding their heads here in the room at that notion. Thank you very much indeed. Before coming here, I read a really interesting report by the think tank Chatham House in London that talked about maybe we've got to get used to geopolitical uncertainty, supply chain problems, climate stress, that's kind of becoming the new normal, which means that we've got to adapt, we've got to learn how to cope with it. And the starting point for that, as Katja suggests, is collaboration. And I, as an optimist, think another key thing is that when you get the right, brilliant, determined, enthusiastic minds engaged, like our panelists, then I think we do have a chance of coming through this and finding some hope. So on that note, would you join me in thanking our panelists here and remotely, all of you who've been watching, listening, taking part. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.